So welcome everybody. This is our session, disability community and the scholarly communication community. And we have a few our community agreements here. So you're welcome here regardless of race, ethnicity, background, disability, sexual orientation, and anything. We assume positive intentions and we make space for others. We also critique ideas, not people. This session is recorded, and if you at any time feel that you want to participate, but at the same time remain anonymous, feel free to go ahead and rename yourself. If you encounter any difficulty with this, let me know or let Nadine know, and we'll happy to help you with this. Generally speaking, also, if you need any support with anything, so feel free to always contact us or private message us. So I'm gonna let our facilitators introduce themselves and get us started. Thank you so much.
Superb. Well, it's really great to be here. And Karen, Erin, and I are really glad to be talking to you today about the C4DISC Toolkit for Disability Equity in Scholarly Communication. That's a bit of a mouthful. So I think we'll all introduce each other at the start of the little sections that we're kind of talking about. So I'm going to cover a few slides, and then Karen a few more, and then we're going to finish with Erin before we talk through some discussion questions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So we are a group of people who mostly have direct lived experience of some kind of disability, and we work in the scholarly communications industry. So my name's Simon. I live in Oxford in the UK. I'm a visually impaired person, and I've worked in scholarly communications for about 15 years. I currently work with the science publisher Elsevier, and I'm responsible for helping make our books and journals more accessible to people with disabilities. As I said, Karen and Erin will introduce themselves shortly. We work together with an organization called C4DISC, who are a joint kind of organization that's made up of various industry groups such as ALPS and Society for Scholarly Publishing, and the American Publishers Association. I think there's 10 or 12 associations altogether that's aimed at campaigning and putting into place best practice guidelines to increase equity within scholarly communications. You may have come across C4DISC's previous toolkits for equity before, which have featured things like race and ethnicity, and also inclusive language. So this one focuses on people with disabilities. I should also mention that due to being a vision impaired person, I can see there's some activity in the chat, but I won't be able to read what it is. So if there's anything super important that you need to interrupt me, please could somebody just interrupt me. But we've
no problem, Simon. I was just sharing the link for the feedback form, so people can have it already from the beginning of the session. Amazing. And they can fill it out by the end of the session or afterwards. And I was welcoming David, our participant here as well.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. So we, as a group, have been working together for a few years now, and the disability landscape has changed quite a lot since then. Since we started, which was kind of, around the time of the pandemic. And we really felt that we wanted to do something specific to scholarly communications as opposed to the very general kind of guidelines that are out there. So I'm now going to talk a little bit more about kind of the purpose of the toolkit exactly. So, why did we decide to put together a toolkit? Well, when we think about disability in the world, there's 15% of the world's working age population, so those between 16 and 64 have some kind of disability. When you include neurodivergent people, that number is more like 20%. So that means that over 1 billion people worldwide have some kind of disability. And that means that if we think about the kinds of people we interact with in the scholarly communication space, so we're not just talking about our colleagues, but we're also talking about the people who read and author journals and books, etc., it's quite likely that quite a significant proportion of them have a disability. However, when you look at employment outcomes for people with disabilities, they tend to be much lower than the rest of the population. And we felt not only is this a shame, but actually as people who care about scholarly communications, we felt that as an industry, we're missing out on people with great skills that can really add value to the industry and the community in which we work, right? So, you know, when I see somebody with a disability, I see somebody who's a good problem solver. I see somebody who's adaptable, right? They might need to go about things in a different way in order to lead a full, independent, active life. I see somebody who might be good at building relationships because they might have to ask for help quite a lot. And what we really wanted to do is frame something through C4DISC, through one of these toolkits, to talk about how to have a good conversation around disability, to really encourage organizations, employers, people who create scholarly communication content to really think about disability inclusion and provide some practical advice that will help the landscape become more disability inclusive. And so we move this from a nice to have to really an integral part of the equity conversation, and frankly, just a daily conversation around inclusion that hopefully we're all having at our workplaces. Next slide, please. So what's our, mission goals? Why are we here, right? So as I mentioned, a lot of it is really about trying to encourage people to think about how to have a good conversation around disability and how to bring about meaningful change within their organizations. It strikes us that actually, whilst there are some very big organizations out there, as I said, I work for Elsevier, so I work for one of them, actually, for a lot of people in our industry, they may be working for smaller organizations and they may not have the support at work to help them fulfill their potential at work. So we wanted to do something that would be a vehicle to build a community around disability inclusion within the scholarly communications industry. So people didn't feel on their own, whether that's you as an employee, but actually if you're an employer as well and you want to provide the right support for people. We feel that disability inclusion, just like the rest of EDI, is a non-competitive sport, right? It's about sharing what we do together and what we've learned. And we thought that this could be a good vehicle in order to do that. So in terms of the goals of what we're trying to achieve here, it's about support, but it's also about providing suggestions, really facilitating those conversations and making people feel that they're part of a community, whether or not that's you that has a disability, whether you're a caregiver, or whether indeed you don't know anything about this, but you want to help your colleagues, you want to help the people that you publish and interact with. Because actually, at the end of the day, scholarly communications, whether it's the industry or what we publish, is for everybody, and we really want to positively help affect that. I'm now going to hand over to Karen, who's going to tell us a little bit more about what the toolkit involves specifically.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I'm Karen Farrell and I work at Indiana University Libraries, so representing sort of a different side of scholarly communications. So the toolkit for disability equity specifically is built on an open sort of monograph publishing site, which Erin is going to show you in real life in just a few minutes here. But essentially what we wanted to do was develop something that was practical. So our hope is that this is something that can actually provide answers to people as they need them. It's also, again, focused specifically on scholarly communications rather than trying to sort of open the door wide to, cover all sorts of issues. We tried to focus it specifically on the kinds of issues that folks in this industry are going to likely run into. And we also really wanted to highlight serving other people with disabilities. So while we also do have some resources for employers, we also have resources for sort of colleagues or allies. We really wanted to emphasize helping folks with disabilities find success in the industry. So I actually am going to have to stop sharing just really quickly because I have a short video to show you, and I realized that I didn't share sound. So give me 1 second and I will reshare. There we go. All right. Now I will give you just a quick introduction to the Toolkit for Disability Equity.
Welcome to the Scholarly Communications Disability Equity Toolkit. 1 in 7 people have a disability. So if it's not you, it's someone you work with. Our toolkit is for everyone involved in scholarly communications. It'll help you be more informed and more disability inclusive. To bring us all together to share and to learn. Because no question is too small or too basic. If you're asking it, someone else is thinking it.
All right, so what is the toolkit? So essentially, we have sort of some welcome and background information about us available there. And then we also have a number of resources that we've curated, again, specifically for scholarly communications. So linking to quite a few different curated resources that we sort of, as a group, decided were relevant and valuable for folks. And then the meat of it is really built around questions and answers. So we tried to think about the kinds of common issues or problems or struggles that folks with disabilities might engage with in entering into the scholarly communication industry and provide answers to those. And in those answers, we give some examples, we give some case studies, and we also then, again, provide sort of more specific resources that might be valuable to that particular case. And now I'm going to hand it over to Erin.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Karen. I'm Erin Osborne-Martin. I work for Wiley as Associate Director for Strategic Analytics. I am based in Edinburgh, despite my accent, and I acquired a spinal cord injury while working for Wiley in 2017. So I've been in publishing for quite a while. I've been a disabled person working in publishing for a little less time. I wanted to give you a little bit more detail on the contents of the toolkit. So I have shared the link in the chat here, but it's also at the top of this slide if you want to kind of capture it and take it down. The main thing to really emphasize from the start is that it is a constantly evolving resource, and it is designed to be flexible and adaptable, and also to be able to be added to over time. So this is where we are at the moment, but it will continue to grow over time, and hopefully you'll see more and more information over time as we get more submissions and more information. So this section that I'm sort of focusing on here is the resources section. We've organized this primarily around resources, which are trusted, vetted, existing resources that we didn't create ourselves, but the steering committee and our volunteers have looked through, and we have found them to be helpful and valuable sources of information. So it's really just collecting information together for people who are trying to find their way around learning about disability, and particularly, as Karen said, disabled people who are trying to learn more about how they can advocate for themselves or how they can advance themselves within the publishing industry. So the this has a number of resources, obviously, collected together. I wanted to highlight, for one example, there is a section on accessibility standards. That's not the primary focus of the toolkit, but it is something that comes up a lot and that people find quite valuable. So we wanted to, again, signpost to existing sources of information around those accessibility standards so that people could know where to go to find more information. There's also some language guidance. And also, while we're on this page, I wanted to emphasize the fact that C4DISC has a number of other toolkits that they have also already produced, including a targeted toolkit for editors, an anti-racism toolkit, and some additional language guidance. So there's signposting to that as well under the language guidance tab. I think that's everything for this page, Karen. So if you could go on to the next one. So this is the common questions section. This is actually only a portion of the common questions section. It is organized around the audience, the intended audience. So you can see here some of the questions that were focused on disabled people's needs. Again, that's always our primary focus here. We also have a section for managers who might be managing disabled people or who are disabled themselves. And we have a section for colleagues and allies. And these are all organized in very similar ways. So they kind of set out a question that comes up frequently. It gives some links to places where people might find some additional information. And many of these also have a case study or scenario at the end where it's kind of a real life example where this has happened. And it just walks through what that might look like in practical terms. We wanted to make sure that the toolkit was very practical and very useful in real life situations. So that was one of the things that we've done throughout as well. And then I think that is it for this slide.
Okay, so, and one final thought, just I know, Erin, you shared the link, which is great. We'll actually be having a formal launch in just a couple of weeks. Yeah. So there may be just a couple more minor changes to the site in the time in between yes. now and then. But so we're going to move on. We had a couple of questions that I'd love for folks in the audience, if you have thoughts that you want to engage around these questions, please do. You're welcome to sort of jump in with these, but we also ourselves have some answers to these to sort of help move us along. So our first question, which I think folks in this group get asked a lot, is how do you get senior management buy-in on disability equity?
So I think that I'm going to kind of chip in here with a couple of initial ideas, but as Karen mentioned, if anyone has additional suggestions or any other feedback, we'd really love to hear it. So I think for me, there's kind of three main things around getting the senior management buy-in when we're talking about disability equity, which can be a challenging task sometimes. So I think the first one is really thinking about what a business case might look like. So I think fundamentally, most senior leaders are very interested in DEI. They are excited about it, but they don't necessarily prioritize it, and they don't necessarily make it kind of an embedded part of their organization. And one of the ways that you can encourage them to do that is to show what the benefits of that would be. So there's a number of different studies showing that increased diversity within an organization leads to additional innovation, stimulates revenue if you're a for-profit company, for example. And also diverse organizations definitely attract top talent. So that's something that people are actively looking for in an employer these days. So if you are in a competitive hiring environment, it makes sense to have an organization that is diverse and that values DEI as a kind of part of their DNA, because employees, that does matter to employees. And then I think the second element for me is obviously you need to get senior managers on side, but there's also an element of kind of leading from where you are within an organization. Advocacy can come from really any part of an organization, and there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of advocate from your position, even within large companies or within small companies. So employee resource groups, for example, are a really great way to channel that advocacy up to senior leadership. This is in some ways, again, easier with larger companies because that kind of ERG, employee resource group structure is often it's just something that's kind of more common in larger groups. But Simon and I recently talked at the Redux conference aimed at university presses in May. And one of the ideas that came out of that was that multiple small university presses could potentially band together to get a kind of cross sector employee resource group for disability advocacy going. That's definitely an option. I think that employee resource group structure it can be very helpful, and senior management tend to take that, fairly seriously. And then finally, I think for organizations that aren't currently tracking DEI metrics, particularly metrics around disability, I think that's one that often doesn't happen. So even in organizations where they are tracking like gender disparity, for example, or gender pay gap in the UK, they may not be tracking information about the number of disabled employees that they have, or any metrics around disability. I'm a firm believer, probably because of my own data background, that what matters gets measured, and what gets measured matters. People pay attention to numbers, and so this is an area where just bringing it up, just mentioning it, just saying like, well, how many disabled employees do we have? Does anyone know? And if we don't, like, how can we change that? How can we start tracking that? I think that really breeds a lot of awareness within an organization. So I feel like I've talked for quite a while on that point, but if anyone else has any ideas or suggestions, I'd love to hear them. So we've got one in the chat. I love this idea of introducing them to people with disabilities, especially people in their organization or relatives. And then we've got share the research on how diversity is a major factor in innovation. That's definitely true. Diverse teams generate more ideas, but more unique ideas, including ones likely to lead to a new approach to goals, challenges, and problems. I think that's spot on. Yeah. And there's definitely, I could have added a number of resources in the chat, but like Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, all of these kinds of Forbes even, they have endless articles about how valuable DEI is to innovation. So if you need sources, they're pretty easy to find. Simon, I can see you're nodding your head. Do you have any thoughts?
I agree. And also, I think, look, just going back to some of the statistics I talked about earlier on, I think, all of these senior leaders have goals. They might be commercial goals, it might be impact goals, whatever it is, it might be audience goals. Actually quantifying it, like you said, Erin, when we're saying, this is, do you want to grow your target audience by 15%? Well, if you do, you need to get some representation in there, because actually nobody's going to really understand how to interact with this group if we're not actually employing anybody from this group. So I kind of, I'm nodding because, I agree fundamentally.
Great. Consensus.
Do we want to move on to another question?
Let's move on to the next question, I think.
Thank you so much for actually including this question, because that was one of the main things I was wondering about. And that was a question that I was planning on asking you guys. So I'm glad you kind of plan for it.
Yeah, well, it's always good to get a bit of discussion going. But you can well imagine that the same themes tend to come up, at a lot of these forums, because actually a lot of people are thinking the same things,
Right. And I think it's also all about harnessing the power of the people, right? And not creating these kinds of differences. And I love also what David and Yasser were sharing in the comments. So Yasser also was saying to provide trainings to stakeholders. I really like also the idea of just introduction and awareness. I feel like so much of the great and groundbreaking work happens when you start with strong awareness and resource groups, as Erin was saying, and I think that's really good ideas in how to engage leadership and get on their radar, basically.
Right. And I think relatability is quite important here, right? In terms of, I think disability is a group that it's quite easy to other, right? You know, they're kind of not like me kind of thing. Whereas actually, when we start talking about it, we realize that this is our colleagues or our readers or the people we interact with every day, all of a sudden realize we're just talking about ourselves and we're just talking about people, and everybody wants to help people. Well, I hope most people do.
Right.
Yeah, fully agreed. And I will just say, actually, sorry, Karen, before you move on, this is a bit of a soapbox topic for me, but there have been a lot of very visible news articles recently about very large organizations getting rid of their DEI teams. So Microsoft is one of them. And I think that now is a really important time for us all to be advocating to senior management and just advocating at our own levels of the importance of this. It does make a difference in where we work. And I personally don't want to work at a place of employment that doesn't value diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And also when you're saying DEI, I'm just reflecting out loud here. I feel like so many people are talking about DEI as a very common term, and it's a flashy term, and people are always talking about diversity, but it's more in the area of maybe cultural diversity or racial diversity, but the consideration of disability diversity or ability diversity in that way is less spoken about. And I really like that DEI is, I mean, it should be very inclusive of disabilities as well, but for some reason, maybe because like the high-tech companies, like all of these DEI flashy words like diversity, equity, and inclusion is the most commonly understood term. But I also share your what you said, Erin, about talking about it more openly and increasing the level of interaction with this term or with this conceptual understanding of DEI.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was actually going to bring up this point about the idea that in 2024, instead of like increasing the levels of access, our just companies and large organizations are turning down the focus on disability inclusion by just remove like getting rid of the DEI teams and specifically accessibility teams. And I haven't known about Microsoft, Erin, but what I know is about X, former Twitter, just back in the days when they got rid of the accessibility team. And Twitter now is not working well, and the disabled community is migrating from Twitter. Just the space there isn't safe for them, and then talking about this scholarly community that disabled people are not feeling quite fine when it comes to the flashy terms that were just considered as a subgroup and not them as the main group. So thank you so much for bringing this.
Definitely agree.
Absolutely. So the next question is, what is the best way to attract and hire people with disabilities? Karen, were you going to have a go at that one?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in some ways, this sort of transitions really well. I was actually, noting Yasser's statement about providing trainings to stakeholders and just thinking about Nadine and your statement about, that it's often just DEI and we don't really talk about the A isn't sort of included as often. But I think a lot of the strategies, the strengths, I think all of the things that are important about DEI, just have a lot in common with that accessibility piece as well, right? And so here, when I think about attracting and hiring people with disabilities, I think honestly, that question, it gets asked a lot, but I always feel like it's too narrow because you're not going to ever attract and hire folks with disabilities and keep them, right? Unless your work culture is ready for it, right? So unless you've done the work to train folks about what it means to, what it means to work alongside colleagues with disabilities, unless you've looked into all of the, various ways. Now, to be clear, folks coming in to employment in a place with a disability are going to have very individual needs, right? There's not a really great way to sort of have some one-size-fits-all solution. But if you haven't taken the time to think about what would it mean to make accommodations, what resources, what financial stuff do we have set aside to help people work differently? How do we approach, how do we think about what's important in someone's job, right? So I think thinking about job requirements, for example, right, is how important is it that someone does the job a specific way, or that they get the versus that they get the outcome that you want. You know, the other thing I always think about with job requirements, when I first started at the libraries here, we had a very standard application for part-time employees that was just, you know, this sort of cut and paste that everyone used. And it always said in the requirements, and this was only 10 years ago. I think we maybe took it out, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, 6 even, I'm not sure, a little before the pandemic. But a standard requirement in there was must be able to lift 40 pounds. Now, these part-time employees were doing everything from sitting at a computer doing, you know, solely computer work, to answering reference questions, to working with data, to possibly shuffling books around in a library. But every single job application said must be able to lift 40 pounds. So I think in terms of hiring, thinking about, you know, what are the actual job requirements that are necessary for the outcomes as opposed to for the how you're approaching it. I think in terms of sort of going through the process of evaluating someone and bringing someone in, there's a couple things that to keep in mind. One is folks with disabilities may or may not be able to hide their disability, and may or may not be ready to share that disability at any given point in the process. And so the things that you can do to sort of set yourself up to indicate that you're open to that conversation are important, right? So things like asking them repeatedly, right? Not just once, but that you have to sort of throughout the process continue to open that door. Is there something else we could be doing for you? Is there an accommodation that you need? And it might even be helpful to give some choices to indicate that you understand that there might be different things that they want, right? Just to indicate that you have some level of understanding. Although important, make sure you can actually provide those accommodations before you offer them. And also having someone, so if you're the hiring manager, you shouldn't be the only one sort of asking and offering that conversation, right? There should be someone else outside of the direct line of hire that the candidate can go to if they want to talk to someone else about it. About disclosing, yeah, disclosing is yeah, I mean, for some people, there's no option there. And for others, it's, you know, a long battle and decision to decide when it's appropriate or when they won't be able to fulfill the job if they don't. I think the last piece I would say, and I think a lot about something called universal design in this, is evaluating candidates in the same way that you would evaluate them on the job. So if someone is doing a job, I don't know, say like mine, where I'm mostly in meetings and we get an agenda in advance and we have time to read the material in advance and consider our responses and then come to the meeting and offer ideas or provide a written report. Does it really make sense to ask folks to answer these sort of broad questions on the, you know, on the turn of a dime? Like, is that really what you need that person in that job to do? Because that's what we often ask people to do in interviews, even though it's not really relevant to their work. So I think really sort of critically looking at how they're moving through that how you're moving people through that hiring process, and that you're actually evaluating them on the skills that you need for the job. Are there other folks? Okay. Yeah, so Yasser mentioned disclosing. Yeah. Any other ideas about this process?
For me, as you mentioned, Karen, it's a systemic thing, right? Obviously, you kind of hope that managers will show good inclusive behaviors, but obviously you can't guarantee. So for me, every interaction that an organization has with potential candidates, disabled or not, we should always be asking, do you have any accessibility needs? Do you have any accommodation requests, right? Because actually often people won't feel comfortable in sharing that with us in the first instance, but might wait until the interview or even after the interview. We have to give people lots of opportunities. I think it's also about making super clear in the job advert that we welcome candidates with disabilities, and even posting in disability specific job boards. I think the final thing is to really try as much as possible to keep conversations about the disability and support that might be needed separate from the assessment as to whether they're, you know, the right person for the job. Often I think a good way of doing this is once you've offered somebody a job, then you sit down with them if they've told you that they have a disability and say, okay, so what accommodations will you need and how can we make this work? And that will give both parties a really good idea about how they can make it work and, you know, actually whether they can make it work as well. I think it's quite important really that we're not shy to talk about it, but it has to be in the right environment, and in the middle of a job interview is certainly not the right environment. It needs to be separate from the kind of competency based types of questions.
Yeah, and I would say it's challenging as an organization to prove that you are a disabled friendly place to work, but it's very easy to show that you're a disabled unfriendly place to work. So I have applied at a number of places where, you know, right from the start, it's been clear that they, you know, weren't thinking about the possibility that they might ever need to have an accessible location for interviewing, that their offices aren't accessible. So certainly pre-COVID, when I have interviewed for jobs, I've had employers be very surprised that I might not be able to get to their third floor up several flights of stairs offices in, you know, central London or wherever. And I think it just shows how deep some of the, you know, how ableist our society is and how deep that goes. I don't think it's anyone intending to be difficult or unhelpful. It's just not something that people tend to think about on a day-to-day basis. And they also don't tend to think of candidates as potentially being disabled. I think one thing I've encountered a lot is that people think that disabled people are a very small proportion of the population, and that's just not true. And a lot of organizations are getting much better at this over time, but it is something that I think comes up very early on, that it's surprising the number of organizations that really aren't clued up about any of this in any way whatsoever.
Any other ideas on this one? All right, should we move on to the next one? Got one more here.
And Simon, I think I'm going to direct this in your direction. So what does a good conversation around disability look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we started to touch on that in the past couple of questions, right? Ask people what they need, you know, is kind of the golden rule here. I think just think about what a good conversation looks like. I think we've got to think about what a good conversation doesn't look like. And what a good conversation doesn't look like is pity. What a good conversation doesn't look like is nosiness and tell me every single thing about your disability and when you got it and how you got it and all of this kind of stuff, right? A good conversation is a practical conversation about what do you need in order to do the things that you need to do, whether that's in the workplace or elsewhere. And furthermore, how can I help you achieve that, right? To have a good conversation about disability, you don't need loads of knowledge or experience about this, right? You don't need a PhD in disability studies. Actually, it's about listening and it's about empathy. It's about keeping it straightforward. And it's about those questions of what do you need and how can I help? And that's basically it. Anyone else?
As ever, I agree with everything that you've said, Simon. But I think one thing I often say when it comes to good conversations around disability is I have also encountered a number of people who feel like they're just not sure what to say around disability, so they don't say anything. And I would always encourage people to just ask. So my mom, for example, has said that. She said, I don't know whether to call you a disabled person or a person with a disability. And I said, well, you know, people have different views on that. So just ask the person. Like, no one's going to get offended if you use the wrong terminology the first time. They may correct you, or they may just tell you what they prefer. And obviously, if you keep doing it, that's not great. But the general rule of thumb, I think, is just to ask people what they need, because everyone's needs are different. Ask them what their preferences are, because often preferences are different. Just ask. It's really totally fine.
I think the biggest barrier to disability inclusion I tend to find is people feeling too afraid to ask, right? Because they're worried about causing offense. I would say that most people in this world, disabled or not, are bright enough and bold enough to be able to understand intent, right? People have asked me all kinds of things, and I can tell whether they're trying to say something helpful and not quite getting it right, or they're really not trying to say something helpful. And I think let's give people credit that they can work that out for themselves. But don't not say anything because you're worried about causing offense. Sorry.
And if I may interject, Simon, when you even help people with disabilities, the idea of asking is really the golden rule, as you just mentioned. There's been a lot done on the idea of asking, including I must credit that Just Ask Don't Grab campaign in the UK, and then many also moved to the a lot of development and establishing this sort of intentional groundwork around disability inclusion. I'm fine disclosing I'm a blind person. I'm a totally blind person. Like, and there's also a big work on considering how accessibility, sometimes I wouldn't say overlaps, but comes along diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this also considers the idea of asking when you need something accessible, and what accessibility practices does a disabled person needs, and all of this. So yeah, so thank you so much.
Great. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments or anything around good conversations?
Yeah, David added something in the chat here.
Okay.
As a teacher, I encourage all my students to reach out if they need anything for any reason. I don't want my disabled students to feel like they're being singled out, because it has been my experience that they want to feel like they belong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, that comes up for us as well, in a university setting, because there are students with disabilities who don't, especially so I'm in the United States, who don't necessarily qualify, including for reasons like their diagnosis may be too old. So if they were diagnosed with something as a kid and not within the last couple of years, they don't qualify for disability services, as though the disability sort of disappeared. So, as an individual instructor or an individual person working with students on campus, it's important to think about the fact that you may have disabled students that you're working with that don't have that legal route that they can work through in the university. All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah. Did people have other questions they wanted to ask or other themes that they wanted to bring up that we haven't covered?
So I actually have a wondering about where AI's role is in C4DISC. How are people making use of AI? How is the toolkit making use of AI? And what, I don't want to say what can the toolkit offer that AI doesn't, of course, but I'm saying, do people with disabilities, like, are they able to get similar kind of affordances through AI than in the toolkit, and what your plans are for integration potentially of AI?
So
because also our participants are very interested in AI, especially.
Yeah,
so I wanted to put that
it's a
angle.
great question. I'm going to challenge you a little bit because that's what I do. I think the versions of AI we have at the moment are what I'm going to call the tech bro version of AI, right? I don't think AI particularly takes great account of minorities, any minorities. And I would say that the kinds of information you tend to get from AI tend to be quite general in my own experience. We didn't really use AI when we came up with this toolkit because it's designed to be a very human-centered perspective.
Which I love about the toolkit, by the way. I also remember talking about that. We met last year, or
of course, yeah.
year before the last. But I remember even talking so much about that with you guys at the conference.
Yeah, and obviously specific to scholarly communication.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that AI doesn't have a role in the future. I think AI has a role with everything in terms of, in all of our lives. But I think that for something like this, really what we're trying to do is share our experience, and I'm not sure that that could be replicated by AI per se.
I guess my question was more related to where do you see actually AI fitting in the future? It was not mainly for, what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I see AI, and I'll be interested to hear what Erin and Karen have to say about this in a minute. I see AI fundamentally as a labor-saving tool in terms of the various tasks, right, that if you have a disability, you might find quite challenging, right? So, for me as a vision impaired person, I have something called an OrCam, which is something that looks a bit like a USB stick with an AI camera on the end. And what the OrCam does is you point it at something like a display board, and the OrCam will read the text out to you, right? That's amazing because I can't do that myself. So I use that to read my post. Clearly, there are a lot of productivity tools that use AI as well that people with disabilities, I'm sure, can make a lot of use of. I've certainly seen it in kind of navigation aids as well. Again, thinking about vision impairment, I'm sure there'll be lots of applications. How relevant that is to the toolkit in particular, I guess we'll wait and see. Erin, Karen, what are your thoughts about AI and how that fits into this whole thing?
So I was just going to throw up, I'm currently co-editing a book where all of the chapters are written by autistic librarians. So one of the things that we've been doing recently is just working through the sort of editing process. For example, we've used something called Goblin Tools, which is actually an AI assistant. And we have used some other tools to recommend and sort of suggest to folks about how to help let AI help them structure their paper. So one of the challenges that not all autistic people have, but when you're thinking about the writing process, one challenge can be sort of thinking about how to organize everything so you can like come up with all of the information and have this, pages and pages of stuff, but how to figure out how to organize it, and AI tools can be helpful in that process. The Goblin tools, on the other hand, can help people sort of judge up. So if it's a little too casual of speak, right, and we want something a little more academic, that tool can sort of help them judge it up a bit. So those are just some ways that we've been using it in that project.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of potential in AI for particularly neurodiverse people. I know on the ADHD front, a lot of my colleagues have found Microsoft Copilot to be very helpful because it provides summaries of meetings. And even, you know, you don't have to go through the entire transcript. You get a much shorter summary with some like action points and bullet points. I think one of the areas where it can be more challenging to use AI is things like, I know Simon mentioned navigation earlier, but it has been a challenge, for example, with wheelchair accessibility or even no like step-free access. To identify that using AI has not been hugely successful so far. But I think that that's just the nature of the kind of data. Even Google Maps, which is user supplied data, is often wrong about accessibility. So there's a specialized site called Ewan's Guide, which is just individual people writing reviews of individual locations saying, yes, this is accessible. This is exactly what I found when I went there. They had ramps, they didn't have ramps, like all of that kind of information. And so I think that's one area where AI does still struggle, but that might change in the future. I know we've got a couple other questions, so I didn't want to go on for too long. I think there was, oh yeah, wondering whether the resources in the toolkit are categorically divided based on the type of disability or not. So I'll start that one off. The answer is that no, they're not. We did talk about that early on, and we talked about looking at different taxonomies of disabilities and how we might arrange all of that information. I think there were kind of two reasons not to go down that route. One of which was just the kind of complexity involved. And I think the other was that not everyone felt the same way about whether or not disabilities can be categorized in that kind of taxonomic tree type structure. But I'd be curious to hear different perspectives from Karen and Simon on that.
Well, I think the other
must note that, you know, that by the categories and types of disabilities I meant, like vision impairment, autism, deafness. It just meant like to just facilitate. If someone is deaf, they can go to X and Y. If someone is blind, they can go to whatever. So that's what I meant. I didn't mean a whole separation from things.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like as an alternate entry point. Yeah, I mean, we did. I think that really goes back to Erin's first point, which is that it got really complicated. So one of the things that I think about a lot, which I already mentioned, is universal design, right? And so the solution, say, for someone who can't maybe can't hear what I'm saying right now, right? Where they want captions on the screen is actually the same solution that I use sometimes when I'm a little too distractible and can't quite focus and I need the written, or I just am having trouble processing sound, which I actually just run into regularly, right? So we both need the same solution, even though the reason for it is really, really different. But to your point, right, because it might be helpful for a user to just be able to go like, okay, I want to go to resources for this or that. I think it was really mostly, as Erin pointed out, just the complexity of it.
I would like to thank all three of you for a great webinar. My attitude has always been as a teacher that we should treat all students as if they're different and make everybody feel inclusive for all the advantages. If I could, I wanted to add one thing about the AI use, because I train a lot of teachers, especially in K-12, but also in higher ed, and I'm using AI a lot to help them make their lessons more inclusive. And what I have found is you can feed these tools. Let's say it's your lesson objectives, which in a lot of K-12 areas has to do with a state standard of some kind, right? So you can feed the AI tool what your lesson objectives are. You can also feed it the research on a specific disability. So maybe it's the research on ADHD, or maybe it's the research on visual, and say, generate ideas for helping me make this lesson more inclusive based on the research for this disability. And it does a fantastic job. It can read, you know, that data so that the ideas it's coming up with to help you diversify your classroom are based on research you vetted, research you believe, you know, is very solid. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great tip.
That's super interesting. Out of interest, what kinds of things does it tend to come up with?
Well, again, you know, it varies tremendously based on whatever specific disability.
Yeah.
I didn't get good results when I just said, you know, to make it more inclusive. I found that I got better results, and the teachers get better results when they're able to be very specific.
Right.
Right about the, as you have all said, I mean, diversity comes in or disability comes in all kinds of ice cream flavors, to use hopefully a positive metaphor.
Yeah.
And so when you're more specific, here's my lesson, here are my objectives. I have students who are X. Okay, they could be learning a language as a learning English as a second language. There's all kinds of ways that our students are diverse. And then, so if you're specific, then it will come up with, and you can say, okay, and the ideas need to be non-electronic. They need to be physical in some way, you know, for in person. So you can be very, very specific in the way that you prompt the bots.
Super.
I think we're about out of time,
Yeah.
unless there's any final questions. I think that's kind of it for us. We
I just
appreciate
want to
y'all.
thank you for opening
Yeah.
up the floor to, you know, to engage us in a discussion about the sort of disability inclusion and how it sort of intersects in different themes. I haven't really, I'm in higher education, but I haven't really considered, you know, this sort of aspect from a scholarly communication community. And yes, I think I have to go and dig deep in the toolkit and explore its resources and, you know, use it and see how it can just maximize my learning and professional development. So thank you so much for the space, for opening up the flow and the space and the engaging discussion.
Well,
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for
We
coming.
appreciate your
Really
time.
enjoyed it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, Erin, Karen, and Simon. This was really great. I really appreciate you. And I really appreciate you coming to MyFest2024 to give the session. I was really happy that you all could manage to make it today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Thank you. All right. See you soon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Erin.